So society tends to view artists as creative and mathematicians as logical. But your work challenges that completely.
A mathematician, like a painter or poet, is a maker of patterns. So I was very lucky in my educational journey that I had a teacher when I was about 12 or 13.
Yeah.
He sort of gave me a key to this kind of secret garden of what really mathematics is about. There's a very interesting eternal debate amongst mathematicians and beyond about whether we are discovering something or are we creating it.
Constraints are the things that force you to think out of the box, to come up with solutions, and to actually just not have things so big, but to narrow things so that you're actually able to do something.
The creativity comes from actually limiting your freedom, but in a productive way.
I think that our education system is so flawed that we're actually ending up killing the creativity of children. The only way to succeed and to start really improving on a new idea is by actually allowing the initial steps of failure to happen.
As a creative artist, you spend most of your time failing. Most of the time it's about rejecting the attempt to break something or go into the new. So it's a very frustrating process. So it is a very difficult thing. We teach mathematics a bit like if we taught literature as just grammar and spelling. Or music as just scales and arpeggios. They're an important part of the skill set of a creative artist, a writer, a musician. The biggest challenge is not falling into repeating patterns of behavior. Leonardo, for example, a lot of his work very knowingly exploits the golden ratio to create a certain effect, because the golden ratio is very related to the Fibonacci numbers.
Your book, Blueprints, which is an amazing book. And
thank you.
I think that it sort of breaks so many of the myths that we have about the arts and mathematics or the sciences being separate.
Mathematics is the language of nature, so you are going to be seeing these mathematical structures all over the things that a creative artist is doing. I really regard us mathematicians as storytellers, and that we are telling stories, our characters, our numbers and geometry, and it's about, which stories are worth telling. AI weirdly might help us to stop behaving like machines and actually start us to make behaving more again as creative human beings. The mathematician is the word choice, because mathematicians are making a lot of choices about what it is they want to write about and investigate.
Creativity and mathematics, do they really have a connection? For many, those two worlds might seem miles apart. One is seen as emotional and expressive, the other as logical and exact. But when you look closer, you begin to see that mathematics itself is one of the most creative languages we've ever invented, a way to explore patterns, symmetry, and even the unknown. Our guest today, Professor Marcus du Sautoy, embodies the intersection beautifully. He's a mathematician whose curiosity transcends boundaries, someone who sees numbers not as limits, but as gateways into imagination. As the Simon Professor for the Public Understanding of Science at Oxford University, he's dedicated his life to revealing the artistry and the wonder within mathematics. Marcus doesn't just study math, he lives it as a creative practice, a way of thinking, perceiving, and making meaning. Today we'll explore how he understands creativity, how logic and intuition dance together in his work, and what this tells us about the creative potential that exists in all of us. Enjoy today's episode on the Creativity Dialogues with Chandana Dixit. So, Marcus, welcome to the Creativity Dialogues with Chandana Dixit podcast. It's such a pleasure to have you. Creativity is at my heart, and you combine mathematics and creativity. So, it's a very, very unique and unusual combination. And I'm so looking forward to this conversation with you.
Well, thanks for having me on.
My pleasure. So, society tends to view artists as creative and mathematicians as logical. But your work challenges that completely. How do you experience creativity in your mathematical research?
Yeah, certainly mathematics is logical, but I think that actually artists in their own turn are often pretty logical in following particular lines of thought. But I think the key word for me that really reveals the creativity at work in my work as a mathematician is the word choice, because mathematicians are making a lot of choices about what it is they want to write about and investigate. Um, you see, I think that most people think that a mathematician is sort of trying to prove all the true statements about numbers and geometry. And that's not the case. You see, most statements about numbers and geometry are completely boring and not interesting. So we're actually making choices about those statements that we think are worthy of exploring, worthy about writing about, worthy of up in front of our fellow mathematicians to tell about our discoveries. There's a short story which I think is one of my favorite short stories, which sort of illustrates, I think, the difference between the mathematician is just proving all theorems and those that make choices. And it's Borges's story about the Library of Babel. This is about a library which supposedly has every book it's possible to write inside the library. And of course, most of those books are completely meaningless because it's just a jumble of letters. And the librarian in the library at first thinks, well, the library contains everything. But actually, as he begins to think about it, he realizes it contains nothing because nobody has made any choices about the things that are worth reading or writing. So I think, for the library, for example, my library in Oxford, the Bodleian Library, is not full of every book that it's possible to write. It's full of the books that, creative writers have decided are worthy of a storytelling. And I think story is a really key word here because I really regard as mathematicians as storytellers, and that we are telling stories, our characters, our numbers and geometry. And it's about, which stories are worth telling. And the stories are very often, the decisions we make, the choices we make as mathematicians are driven by a sense of aesthetics, a sense of narrative, a sense of moments of jeopardy when the proof seems to be going in strange directions. You're taking your readers, your members of the audience on a journey. And so I think for me, that's the creativity of being a mathematician is, well, what stories do you want to tell? Which are the ones that are interesting? Which are those that are really not worth elevating to being called mathematics? So I think the mathematician's kind of library is more like the writer's library. It's full of choices that are being made, not just full of all the true things you can say about numbers and geometry.
Marcus, this is the most unexpected thing that I would think of any mathematician to say. It breaks the idea of what we think, the way we think that mathematicians would think. And just what you said right now is completely contrary to that. So how did you find this connection or this underlying sort of, perhaps it's actually just obvious. It's the way things are. Yet we never see it that way. We think these are separate things. When did you sort of start to see this connection?
Yeah, well, I think the mistake is made in our education system, and mathematics is taught in a kind of with the idea of utility very much at its heart. So it's sort of trying to teach skills to be able to do certain things, and it doesn't celebrate the kind of beauty that's inherent in mathematics. You see, I think that we teach mathematics a bit like if we taught literature as just grammar and spelling. Or music as just scales and arpeggios. They're an important part of the skill set of a creative artist, a writer, a musician, but that's not a novel, that's not poetry, that's not a symphony. So I think that, the tragedy is that most people, when they're exposed to mathematics, are just exposed to the kind of grammar and of the subject, and not exposed to the stories, you see. And so I was very lucky in my educational journey that I had a teacher when I was about 12 or 13 that he sort of gave me a key to this kind of secret garden of what really mathematics is about. And he recommended a few books to me that he thought would kind of open up the kind of beautiful side of mathematics. But one book in particular, which is very relevant to our discussion of creativity, and is one that I would really recommend anybody who's watching this to read, because it's not just about mathematics, it's really about what it means to be a creative artist. It's called A Mathematician's Apology. It's by a Cambridge mathematician called G.H. Hardy, who wrote it sort of the middle of the 20th century. He was interested in number theory. He was worked with Ramanujan, the very famous Indian mathematician. But he wrote this beautiful book, not so much about mathematics, but what it means to be a mathematician. And in there he writes, a mathematician, like a painter or poet, is a maker of patterns. And he stresses the kind of creative side of being a mathematician. And he sort of dismisses the mathematics that is useful for engineering or creating bridges or things like this as the very boring mathematics. And that's, he really celebrates mathematics as a subject sort of just not for utility, but for discovering the eternal truths of the universe. And he kind of says, I'm interested in mathematics not as a useful science, but as a creative art. And I think this really appealed to me, because at the time that I was at school, this was about 12 or 13. So I was starting to learn the trumpet. I was doing a lot of theatre at the time in my school. Yet my education kind of system was trying to push me to make a choice between being a scientist or going the humanities route. And I didn't really, I was enjoying both. I was enjoying being exposed to kind of Shakespeare, literature, poetry. And so it was it was a real just blessing that this maths teacher at my school revealed to me that mathematics was my bridge in a way between these two, because it's certainly true that mathematics is the language of nature. It helps us to understand how the universe works. I mean, all sciences really need mathematics to be able to articulate their ideas. Yet it has this creative side to it. Now, people might be quite surprised by that, in the sense that, well, you can't make something true if it's false. And so it seems like, as you said, you use that word logical right at the beginning, and it seems like that word logic limits your kind of ability to be creative. But actually, this is the kind of other side of this whole debate about, we started about calling maths logical, artists creative, but actually, artists themselves talk a lot about the importance of logic, about constraint, about structure, to being able to develop their own work. So it feels to me that there's, people don't understand that a creative artist, in their own turn, actually puts limitations and boundaries, just as in the same way in mathematics we have the limits of logic. I think that there's a very interesting eternal debate amongst mathematicians and beyond about whether we are discovering something or are we creating it. And I think mathematicians have a bit of a schizophrenic relationship to these two words, because in some ways, a statement about numbers is sort of true separate from a human sort of discovering it. So there is I've already used the word discover. It feels like it's there waiting for us to reveal, and therefore there is an element of discovery. Yet it's a creativity comes in because we're choosing which of those discoveries we want to make. And I think you could almost think of music as there's a whole range of possible pieces that you could write. We have the scale system, we have rhythms and things like that. So you could think of music as just discovery as well. It's just that somebody discovers a particular way of putting notes together and we get excited by it. But the creativity is about that choice. Which one are we going to choose? So mathematics is the same, although you can't make something true if it isn't, but still it's about choosing which things are you going to spend your time then developing and showing a truth.
Yes. In fact, you touched upon two things that stood out to me. One was, of course, this very, very important concept of, do you create or do you discover? So I was just wondering that is it possible to go a little in depth? Because I think we as humans struggle so much with this idea that do we deliberately go out to create something, or do we just discover, or are things actually there? And then what are the qualities we need to bring about in order to decide when is it time to make an effort to make something, and when is it time to just sort of be quiet enough to be able to discover these these mysteries which are there for the attentive mind to unravel, to discover.
Yes. It's, in all disciplines, this is an eternal debate about discovery and creativity. And I think, it's about how much freedom you allow yourself, I think, sometimes, because sometimes the creativity comes from actually limiting your freedom, but in a productive way. So Stravinsky, for example, always used to say, I can only be creative under huge constraints. But the exciting thing for him was finding a really interesting set of rules, and then it was an element of discovering what is possible within that kind of constraint. Whilst if you allow yourself much more freedom, often that can be a killer for creativity.
Completely.
If you have no limits, the blank stage, the blank stave, the blank page, the blank canvas.
It's too vast. And
you really, then it's just like, well, why should I choose one thing over another?
And people think that having constraints is actually going to curb your creativity. In fact, people come up with these excuses all the time. If we think about it in very simplistic terms, they think that I don't have money, I don't have education, I don't have contacts. They begin with the most basic things as to why they're unable to create. But these sound like just excuses, because in fact, constraints are the things that force you to think out of the box, to come up with solutions, and to actually just not have things so big, but to narrow things so that you're actually able to do something. It's so beautiful the way that you brought this up, that yes, it is constraints that actually allow things to get created.
Yes. And I think those constraints lead to kind of structures that you create within which you are then exploring your kind of creativity. And I think that word structure for me is the key to this whole debate, which is structure is the word which links both the creative arts and mathematics. Because if I was going to define mathematics, you see, most people think, oh, what's this professor of maths doing in his office in Oxford all day? Is it long division to lots of decimal places?
Yeah.
And so, that's the mistake that people make. They think it's about arithmetic or sort of doing calculations. And it's really not. That's like saying that being a novelist is about knowing how to spell. It really isn't. In fact, you can be a terrible speller and a wonderful novelist.
Yeah.
Just in the same way as you can be a brilliant mathematician and useless at your multiplication tables, which I am. So because mathematics, and this is the thing that I sort of discovered as my teacher sort of exposed me to the wonderful ideas in this magic garden that he revealed to me, the mathematics, if I was going to define it, is the study of structure. And so because artists are so interested in structure as being the framework for their creativity, this is why you get this resonance between the two. Because, time and again, when I work with creative artists and they show me the sort of things that they're interested in, often they've honed in on a structure which they don't realize is mathematical at heart, but it's something that, with my mathematical language, I will recognize as, well, but that you're using this really interesting mathematical structure in order to stimulate your creativity.
Excellent. And before we move forward, I realized that there was a certain aspect of mentorship that happened in your life because of a teacher stepping in. So if you could sort of explain to someone who is kind of struggling, they're feeling lost, they like a few different things that appear conflicting on the surface, that, oh, I like maths, but then I like the arts as well. So who am I? And do I have to be one or the other? And you were fortunate that you had a teacher step in and sort of, show you how to overcome struggle. And also, the minute I think you became relaxed with this, it's sort of how relaxing it is when we find some place where we can become stable and then navigate the way through this.
Yes, I think, one of the tragedies of our education system is the siloing of subjects, such that, a student goes to the maths class and then goes to the history class, then goes to the music class, and doesn't realize that there are, these strands which are weaving through all of these subjects. So I think, I was very lucky to have the freedom to do all of these things. And as time has gone on, I've begun to see those connections more and more. But I think, for me, this maths teacher just showed me ideas of things like the Fibonacci numbers. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13. They've got a pattern to them. That's another important word, which I think links the world of the arts and the world of mathematics, which is pattern. So the pattern is that you get the next number by adding the two previous numbers together. And so these numbers have interesting properties. The other exciting thing is that you find these numbers all over the natural world. And this is another kind of key connection, is that these structures that artists are interested in, the structures that mathematicians are interested in, very often are structures that we are already seeing being used by nature. And of course, that is what we're all doing. We're all responding to our place in the universe. And I think our creativity is, a very powerful tool to understand how we navigate our way through the universe, both alongside other humans who are creative, but also just to kind of understand our place in this universe. And so, artists are doing that with their work very often. So they are going to be responding to the structures that make up the kind of blueprints of nature. And so a mathematician as well, it's very often the mathematics is driven by trying to understand how the universe works. So, for example, the Fibonacci numbers, you find them in nature because very often the way nature grows things uses these numbers. But then again, they're called the Fibonacci numbers after an Italian mathematician of the 12th and 13th century. But they really shouldn't be called the Fibonacci numbers because he wasn't the first to discover them. They were already discovered in India by poets and musicians because these numbers also help you to count the number of rhythms that you can make out of long and short beats. So a poet or a tabla player who wants to kind of explore all the different ways that rhythm can be used in their work will very naturally be drawn to these numbers because out of long and short beats, the number of rhythms that you can make is counted by these Fibonacci numbers. So you see this kind of just the interplay that happens between all of these subjects, which is totally counter to the way our education system
Yeah.
is built.
I know, and thank you for sharing this, because I think that our education system is so flawed that we're actually ending up killing the creativity of children. And then we kill it, and then once they turn into adults, we ask them that why aren't you creative? That why are you unable to think? So we get them to just obey and follow us with our weaknesses. And then we ask them, why don't you come up with anything new, anything original, any ideas that you have about what actually would help? Because this is a really big challenge in today's times. And I think that these voices need to get loud enough for something to really stick about what needs to happen, because we're killing the creativity of our youth, all the potential, by just making them people who are just, who just read and can repeat, and they're just becoming people who obey. They're becoming workers. They aren't really becoming explorers, adventurer seekers, and eventually creators. That's
It is a really difficult challenge because, creativity by its very nature is kind of venturing into the new. And very often, as a creative artist, you spend most of your time failing. Most of the time it's about rejecting the attempt to break something or go into the new. So it's a very frustrating process. So it is a very difficult thing somehow to.
And that's what you said, Marcus, that's so important, that failing. I think that society is unable to accept the failing part. So when they're children, we want them to start giving us perfect results. And that can only happen by copying, by just rehearsing whatever is already known, just repeating and practicing that. And so we do not allow failing. This is something so important that you said, that the only way to succeed and to start really improving on a new idea is by actually allowing the initial steps of failure to happen, to allow something to really get polished and created and figured out.
Yes. So I think it is a balance because, as we said before, if you just give somebody a blank page or a blank stage, they will not be able to do anything. So you need to give them some tools which are kind of learning methods, learning things of the past. I mean, it's very important that most creative artists, of course, train first of all by understanding the art of the past. I mean, take Picasso. Picasso was, consummate artist in being able to reproduce style of previous artists. And that was an incredibly important part of his learning curve into his own creative breakthrough, which was by breaking things. He understood where we were coming from and decided, what if I break this? Will it lead to something interesting? So I think it's a balance. We can't just turn our education system into a kind of free-for-all. So we want to give people those tools to understand how we got to where we are at the moment, to be able to move into the new. So, but I think, the trouble is that the education system has moved, too far in just teaching kind of
just the academic sort of,
Yeah. So I think it's very interesting because, when it comes to mathematics, we often celebrate India and the teaching of mathematics in India because your students who get to a very high level through the education system, and so and also in India, it's in Europe, it's a real badge of honor to say you're bad at maths, but in India, you would never kind of admit, even if you are bad at maths, because it's got a certain amount of respect to it. However, when I've talked to maths teachers in India, they do say, our students are very good, but they're not creative. They're taught methods of calculus such that they can turn the handle and, get to a very high level. But if you give them a problem which is slightly off curriculum, they are completely lost.
Thrown off, yes.
Yeah, so I think this is the balance between giving people the tools to be able to kind of be creative, but still giving them the space such that they aren't boxed in by these tools to just repeating things that have been done before. So we just, we're not creative. We're just another machine implementing things that we've known already for many years.
Absolutely. You've said that creativity became humanity's tool for exploring our inner world when consciousness emerged. Can you unpack the connection between consciousness, awareness, and the creative act?
Yes. This was inspired by reading the psychologist Carl Rogers, who talked about creativity, the importance of creativity, and my reading of his analysis of creativity kind of led me to this idea that probably, when did creativity emerge? When did we become artists as a species? And I think it probably my conjecture is that it may well have coincided with the moment when our species became conscious. Consciousness is a very slippery thing, but probably there's there's probably a spectrum across the animal kingdom. I have a cat who's very much lives in the moment, spends a lot of her time sleeping. So I think her consciousness isn't the same as mine. I don't think she's kind of at a kind of level that the human is. And I think a phase change probably happened in the human species where consciousness and a sense of ourself, our sense of our inner world, our emotional world, being able to observe ourselves. I mean, I spend every morning doing a bit of meditation, and the ability of the brain to observe its thoughts is a very sophisticated. And then the question is, once consciousness is emerging within one human being, then you're kind of interested to know, well, what is the consciousness like of another human being? Are they experiencing this idea of pain, of ecstasy in the way that I am? And so my conjecture is that our creativity probably emerged at the same time as our consciousness, because we needed a tool to kind of explore that, our own inner world, to sort of be able to articulate what was happening, but more importantly, perhaps to investigate whether there's a connection with the other human being, and expanding our consciousness so we become more aware of our sort of what's happening to us and our place and our relationship to others. So, I think the novel, for example, is a very good example of an exploration of our conscious identity. So we are using a novel when we're writing it to explore the inner world of characters, which is probably coming out of our own exploration of our inner world, but also our relationship to other people. So we're exploring kind of what might be going on in the mind of the other. You see, there's a big challenge, which is one of the big challenges of science, which is the hard problem of consciousness. How can we really be sure that, I'm talking to you now, there's a, we're talking on different sides of the earth, maybe you've just created some incredibly fancy avatar that is doing all the work. How do I really know that you're conscious? By exchanging ideas and language and stories, we begin to understand that there is a conscious kind of being behind this facade. And so I think understanding that consciousness, understanding whether there are similarities, differences, I think pain is a very interesting example, because it's very difficult to understand the pain of another. You empathize because you identify it with your pain, but there's probably different levels of pain, and being able to articulate those through a painting or through a piece of music. I mean, I think for me, music is almost the purest expression of emotion that we have developed. That the written word is very powerful, but it's often feels like it doesn't quite capture the complexity of our inner world. And so I often talk about it in mathematical terms, like the written word is a kind of low dimensional projection of the kind of complexity of what's happening in our brain. It's like the word chair has to stand for many different sorts of chair, and the word pain has to stand for many different sorts of pain. And so, but my feeling is that music is a kind of higher dimensional expression of our consciousness. And so that's what's interesting. Each art form has its own kind of special ability to access different bits of our identity. So that's why an artist, why will an artist decide to move to music as opposed to the visual world or opposed to the written word, to express their ideas? And my feeling is that each one has its own ability to capture part of what it means to be conscious.
You know how this, I think, is a struggle for everyone, because being conscious is probably the most important human quality that we need to lead a meaningful life. What do you think helps you to stay conscious? Because in the beginning you mentioned that you meditate. What are the practices or the conscious efforts you take in order to be and remain conscious?
I think the biggest challenge is not falling into repeating patterns of behavior, because that is when you start to, you move away from being a conscious, creative human being to being more like a machine. We all fall into that trap because we have patterns of the day. And, I think, I've just written a play about the idea of free will. And you see, how many moments do you genuinely have a choice in your life? Quite a lot of the time, things are just mapped out for you, and you're pushed and pulled around by the laws of nature or the laws of society. So for me, what is very important in sort of maintaining my consciousness or the life inside is to continually challenge myself with new projects. So I think that's. I love just trying to do something completely new, like write a play or work with a composer, or when I'm writing my books to shift from one topic to a very different sort of topic. I'm writing a book at the moment about why scientists love walking in the mountains. I love walking in the mountains myself, but it's very different from my previous book, which we'll probably talk about in a little bit, which is about how the creative arts use mathematics to stimulate their activity. And the previous book before that was about games.
So I think it's really amazing that you say this, because it's when you want to stay present, which is that you're constantly looking for something new. Most people like to say that once I've discovered something successful, a formula, just keep repeating it so that, you can just keep seeing success. It takes a lot of personal integrity. It takes a lot of courage to abandon what you've done before and say that I'm going to go and find something new every time. I think these are the perfect qualities and the characteristics of the creative human. When you challenge yourself consistently, when you say that you go out into nature, when you meditate, I think these are the things that are really enabling you to keep growing and to keep, staying alive, the way you just said, that you seek that liveliness.
Margaret Bowden, who's a cognitive scientist that I really appreciate her writing on creativity. She has a definition of 3 different sorts of creativity. The first is exploratory creativity, which is like pushing things to the extreme. That's a little bit like following the rules, but seeing, how far will the rules go.
Yeah.
But I think the sort of creativity which, I really enjoy exploiting is combinational creativity. So taking kind of ideas and structures from one realm and then moving them into a completely different realm. So I do that a lot with my mathematics. So I will go to a seminar in an area which is completely not mine, but I will see a way of thinking that I can actually implement in my own area, which will take me in a new direction. So I think, a lot of people talk about this being, composers going to art galleries. Well, you're not going to hear any music there, but you see pictures and paintings which suddenly give you ideas in your own realm. So I think that's a very powerful way of challenging yourself by
Absolutely.
looking at the creativity of a completely different discipline. The third category is also an interesting one because it's transformational creativity. And this is about the challenge of breaking the structures that you're working within at the moment. And very often when you break something, it fails. So the challenge is, tolerating failure for a start, but also experimenting with, what can I break or what can I change the rules to make it a completely different system that will lead to something that is that doesn't fail, which is rich in its consequences. And you see that with Schoenberg, for example. Schoenberg said, "Okay, I'm going to break this kind of idea that we have to work within a kind of harmonic scale structure of major and minor scales. Let's make every note of the chromatic scale sort of equal, this 12-tone system." And that was you were breaking harmonic structure. Yet that breaking led to, often when you break something, you have to introduce new structures. So Schoenberg, he didn't just say, "Okay, now we're going to just do anything." He said, "No, okay, the 12 notes of the chromatic scale are going to be regarded as equal, but now I'm going to use ideas of symmetry in order to explore those 12 notes." And Schoenberg's kind of 12-tone row system has quite a lot of structure, but it's a completely different structure to the harmonic world that preceded Schoenberg. So that transformational creativity, which you see a lot at the beginning of the 20th century, you see a lot of people breaking things. You see Schoenberg's doing it, Picasso's doing it, the modernist writers, Joyce, Eliot, are breaking things. The Dada movement is, suddenly saying, well, let's have no structure, let's explore randomness as a structure. And this is really breaking out of just, it's a response to the politics of the time. The politics of the time led to the First World War, and they're saying, this is a result of the ways of thinking we had before. We need to change this. So that's what's exciting. Those ideas of exploratory creativity, but combinational and transformational, I think, are really powerful things to think about as a creative artist, mathematician, scientist. Those are the things which lead you into things which we can call creative.
Yeah, I think it's so important. Thanks for sharing Bowden's all these three sort of options of how you can create. And I was very interested that you said you picked combinational, and I understand that because of your very diverse interests. And also I think that is what creators do, because if you stay in just one field, for example, that if I'm a vocalist, it's very easy to just keep on repeating the same things. And with that, you just become more skilled because you're repeating. But creative, there's a distinct difference between skill and creativity. So I think people sometimes mistaken that when they hear artists, they really like, the skillfulness, but the moments which take your breath away are those when something so unexpected, something completely that you didn't think would happens. And that's because the player, the musician, the artist just suddenly used a completely different thought process. They sort of interpreted something different into their creative act. And I think that's the kind of combinational thing that you're describing, which makes it so powerful and which actually makes it creative.
Yes, but one shouldn't underestimate the power of just staying within a rule set. I mean, exploratory creativity, sometimes, within that rule set, there's still so much more to discover. I mean, I think, Bach coming out of the Baroque. He pushed things to the absolute limit, and then it broke, and we get the classical period after that, which is a challenge to the ideas of the Baroque. But Bach revealed that there's just so much more you can do within this kind of world that he was working within. So he didn't. I think he's a great example of somebody who really used exploratory creativity to find his creativity.
Yeah, totally. Now, Marcus, let's move to your book, Blueprints, which is an amazing book. And
Thank you.
I think that it sort of breaks so many of the myths that we have about the arts and mathematics or the sciences being separate, because you have so uniquely demonstrated how they're actually deeply connected. It's actually embedded one in the other. And it would be wonderful if you could sort of pull up some of the main concepts that you cover in the book.
Yeah, well, we've talked about quite a few of them already.
Yeah,
I mean, this is a book which is really grew out of the work I've done over the many decades that I've been working with creative artists, and I really wanted to just write about all of these stories about how often I will work with a musician and find the things that they're interested are structures that I recognize as kind of ideas of mathematics. So the book is, I've used this idea of blueprints, which is my word for kind of structure or mathematical structures. Because a blueprint's quite an interesting sort of concept, because it's like a skeleton, which is allows you to build many things using that skeleton. So the way the book is structured is to take mathematical structures, different sorts of mathematical structures, and to reveal how artists have used these structures in their own creative work. I did think of structuring the book actually in the opposite direction, because I thought, maybe people are going to be scared of the mathematics, and maybe I should start with the artists and let the mathematics kind of reveal itself. But I'm really glad I was brave enough to flip it and actually start with the mathematical ideas, because in this way, one of the revelations for me was just seeing how a mathematical idea, for example, the first mathematical structure that's talked about in the book is prime numbers, how prime numbers are used in different ways by different artists. So primes being used by a composer or a poet or an architect or a writer are very different, yet they all start from the same blueprint of primes. So let me just demonstrate that, because I think the demonstration should hopefully reveal just how the book is working. Prime numbers, just to remind your viewers, are the indivisible numbers like 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13. So these are the building blocks of all numbers. They're kind of the blueprints from which you make all of mathematics. So they're the indivisible numbers. Now, I actually start each chapter with a story of one artist who's used this mathematical structure in an interesting way. And the story of the primes starts with Olivier Messiaen, French composer of the 20th century, who wrote one of the most iconic pieces of classical music in the 20th century called The Quartet for the End of Time. This is a piece he wrote whilst he was a prisoner of war in Stalag 8A during the Second World War. And he discovered there were 3 other musicians in the prisoner of war camp. He played piano. There was an upright rickety piano in the prisoner of war camp. And then there was a clarinetist, a violinist, and a cellist. And he wrote this piece for the quartet, which was first performed in January 1941 for all the other prison inmates, many of whom had never been to a classical music concert and were quite blown away by what they were listening to. But there's an amazing use of mathematics and these prime numbers at work in the piano part of the first movement. So the first movement is called the Liturgie de Cristal. It starts with the violin and the clarinet exchanging bird themes. Messiaen was very obsessed with nature. But then in the piano part, you get this amazing pattern happening. There's a 17-note rhythm sequence, which is just repeated over and over again. So you think, that's very boring. It starts off crotchet, 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 then goes into a nice syncopated rhythm, then crotchet, minim, then repeats. But the harmonic structure does something very different. It's 29 chords, which are just repeated over and over again. So both of those independently sound very boring because it's just like repetition. But it's when you put the two together.
Mm-hmm.
So the pianist is playing these 29 chords, but 17 of them are played in this rhythm. Then the rhythm starts again, but it's working its way through the 29 chords. When the 29 chords finish, the rhythm is in the middle of it somewhere else. So weirdly, although the thing is very patterned, you never hear the same thing repeated because the rhythm and the harmony are completely out of sync because Messiaen chose prime numbers. 17 and 29 are both indivisible numbers. Just imagine if he'd chosen a 15-note rhythm sequence and a 30-note harmonic sequence. You see, that would repeat immediately.
Yeah,
You'd
that
have
would just come
rhythm
right.
15, and then so it was his clever use of these primes to just keep things out of sync.
And
I
we
had the
have
chance
this. We actually do this in Indian classical music.
Absolutely,
that the way
yes.
that we sing, it's the ragas. We keep improvising, and you break the rhythms, you change, you completely improvise. But you have to come back on the first beat, the sum. So you kind of travel, and the way you stay consistent with the time is that you come back on that first beat. So
yeah. Well, absolutely. And Messiaen actually, you see, I thought, is he a mathematician? And I talked to George Benjamin, a composer that he worked with, and he said, no, he really understood these on a kind of intuitive aesthetic level. And one of the things that he did spend a lot of time doing was discovering Indian rhythm structures. So he probably picked this up from the way, absolutely, as you say, Indian musicians really enjoy exploring the complexity of number in this way. And, I did a workshop for a play that I was helping out with, a disappearing number with Complicite, and Nitin Sawhney, great musician here in London, came in and did some workshops exactly about Indian rhythm and just revealed just the clever way that primes will be used. But, exactly as you said, you want the thing to come cycle.
It's cyclic.
Yeah. So that's the beauty. And I think Messiaen was just taking this to another extreme. But, I suppose one important thing, which we've already talked about, but I would say it's a blueprint of the whole book, is the blueprint of the book, if I was going to have one, is a triangle, because we've already seen, the creative arts at one corner, mathematics at the other corner. But as I said, all of these structures very often already are in nature. So the triangle is this interrelationship between the natural world, the artistic world, and the mathematical world. And there's a beautiful example of these prime numbers and the way they keep things out of sync in nature, which is a cicada that you find in North America, mostly on the East Coast, which has a bizarre life cycle where it hides underground for 17 years doing absolutely nothing, and then emerges into the forest every 17th year. Which is a prime number, of course. There's another species which appears every 13 years, but there are no species which appear 12, 14, 15, 16, or 18. There's something about the primes which is important for the cyclical behavior of the cicada. And we think that it's because there used to be a predator that also used to appear in a cyclical behavior. And by choosing a prime number, the cicada could keep out of sync of that predator. So, the cicada and the predator are a bit like the rhythm and the harmony of Messiaen. They kept out of sync, and seems like the predator died out, and the cicada's left with this, 17-year life cycle, just the same prime that Messiaen used. So this is what's so beautiful, and it comes up time and again in the book about how a structure that I recognize mathematically is something that artists sometimes knowingly use, but most interestingly, like Messiaen, intuitively are drawn to, but yet somehow have sort of already their place in the natural world.
It's so interesting. This brings us back to what we discussed earlier on, that is, are things there that are just waiting to be discovered, or do you make them? So I feel we go about this in interesting ways. Sometimes we just stumble upon it when you seek, and sometimes you can go very deliberately and, sort of figure out that this is how it would be. It's so mysterious, and yet it exists for the one who
Yeah.
really is willing to go and explore and discover these truths.
I think it relates to, Kant's idea of how do we gain knowledge. Our first
So
way of gaining
philosophy.
knowledge is through our senses, but then we use our analytic mind to develop what we've seen in the senses. So we have our senses allow us to see light of particular frequencies, but the mathematics that we develop of light makes us to understand that there are electromagnetic waves of frequencies that we can't see, but we develop tools to be able to explore those. So I think that's similar to the exploration of somebody stumbling on a particular structure, yet then using their analytic mind to explore, well, what are the consequences of this thing that I've discovered?
Amazing. So, Marcus, could you share some more of perhaps, how architecture, how poetry, because you have this lovely example of Shakespeare and how he kind of,
yes.
we have to kind of go with.
Yeah, this is a beautiful example of the way the primes are used in different ways. So, take architecture, for example. So, primes are very important for acoustics in a concert hall because, again, in a concert hall, you don't want things sort of building up and there being, dead parts of the concert hall and booming. So if you look at a modern concert hall, you see this incredible kind of mosaic structure on the sides, and that's using primes to actually create the acoustics. But then when you come to literature, you might think, well, where on earth is this going to happen in literature? And one of the lovely things about writing a book is the surprises that you have. So my big revelation was to discover that Shakespeare, who we celebrate as being a fantastic wordsmith, is also a bit of a number nerd and really loved exploring the power of number to do interesting things. So perhaps in a similar way, to Messiaen, because, rhythm is clearly important to a poet. And for Shakespeare, the rhythm that he wrote most in was iambic pentameter, 10 syllables broken up into 5 units of 2, which go short, long, short, long, short, long, short, long, short, long. But he doesn't always do that. And when he wants to wake you up, he disrupts things by taking you from 10 to a prime number. So what is the most famous line of Shakespeare? To be or not to be, that is the question. If you count it up, to be or not to be, that is the question. It's 11 beats. It's a prime number. And as you sit there as an audience member, you're kind of shocked out of your sense of the beautiful rhythm of iambic pentameter, and you start to listen. And so Shakespeare does this a lot. It's almost code for the importance of this speech. Take Macbeth. Is this a dagger that I see before me? Shakespeare didn't need the that in there, but the that disrupts things and makes it 11 beats. But this isn't the only way he uses primes. When magic is being used in Shakespeare, you find the number of beats going down to 7, kind of, a very kind of mystical number throughout many cultures. But this use of 7, again, is very disruptive because, most rhythms in Western poetry comes in 2s, 4s, 8s, 16s. In fact, there was a king who banned poetry in anything other than an even number because he felt that odd numbers were just really dangerous somehow. So then when you get, when magic is coming into something like Midsummer Night's Dream, when Puck is squeezing the magic potion into the eyes of the lovers to make them fall in love with the wrong people, churl upon thine eyes I throw, all the charm this flower doth owe, something like that. But it's 7 syllables, churl upon thine eyes I throw. So Shakespeare's using these numbers almost as code to indicate what's happening in the plays.
That's so interesting, Marcus. And, with this, I kind of the odd, in very simple language, it's like the odd numbers, the even numbers. The odd numbers tend to kind of get your attention because they're disruptive in a sense. And the even numbers sort of feel more friendly, easy. And, I found this in the notes as well. When I teach my students music, especially kids, I tend to, when we come to the major notes, I tend to call them as happy notes and the minors as sad. Would you be able to sort of elaborate a little bit on these
Well,
ideas?
I think again it comes back to the role of these numbers in nature. We are an animal with two legs, two arms, two eyes, and so music especially will be something that you might dance to. And having two legs means that it's easier to dance to something which is divisible by two. So things which are divisible by two are easy to pull apart into two groups. And throughout culture, it's many cultures, ancient Greece, ancient China, regarded even numbers as feminine in nature and odd numbers as masculine. And the ancient Chinese even went as far as saying, well, yeah, but some odd numbers still can be broken down nicely. So, like 15 is, you can arrange in like 3 by 5, but a prime number, you cannot do that. There's no way to arrange it in a nice rectangle. So they regarded the prime numbers as kind of like the macho numbers. These are the really indivisible ones. So I think there is some sort of connection of these numbers in their resonance. And it's funny, coming back to Ramanujan always, people used to say of him that he knew every number is his own personal friends, that every number has its own characteristics. So, some odd numbers are still divisible and therefore have a certain character. And so I think and that comes back to what a mathematician does. We are storytellers about these numbers because they all have kind of interesting different characters. Primes have their own character. Fibonacci numbers, which are again a structure which comes up in the book, used by architects like Le Corbusier. Le Corbusier used the Fibonacci numbers because he understood that they were somehow important to the way nature grows things, so he used them to grow his buildings. So although many people will say, well, Le Corbusier's buildings look, very stark and ugly, actually, if you ask the people who live inside those buildings, they love living inside, for example, the l'unité d'habitation in Marseille. The residents there love it because they feel the organic structure of these numbers at work to make a space which feels almost as if they're living in nature, despite the fact that when you look at the building from the outside, it feels very, like that kind of 60s architecture, very aggressive architecture, but actually it's very organic.
Yeah. Architecture, design, I've realized how integrated these things are because in Indian classical music, when we talk of notes, it's not just happy and sad. So we sing actually not just the major and minor, but we sing notes in between. So micro notes. And we believe that this is connected, the ragas is connected with the nature, with the time cycle, as in morning. So we have ragas. They believe certain notes work best in the morning. Then we have afternoon ragas, evening ragas, night ragas, even seasonal. So the monsoons or fall, they're just different ragas. And the way that, you're showing how mathematics applies, it's just amazing how time cycles, everything, it's just so magically integrated that there's
I think
a
you've
wonder.
perfectly illustrated, that the way that an artist is truly responding to what's happening in the natural world around them and the cycles that they're seeing there, the structures that they're seeing there, and that that is mathematics is the language of nature. So you are going to be seeing these mathematical structures all over the things that a creative artist is doing. And, that in turn, I'm hoping my book will be an inspiration for those who are perhaps wanting to expand their creativity because by understanding these mathematical structures, I've already mentioned some things like primes and Fibonacci, but there's like fractals or hyperbolic
even
geometry,
fractals.
or the idea of
if you could go a little bit over fractals, because we miss that.
fractals are super interesting because the story that I start that chapter with is the way they appear in Jackson Pollock's work.
Yes.
I mean, and Jackson Pollock's work, people probably think, well, but surely anyone can make a Pollock because you just flick paint around.
But you can describe that
Pollock
because I think people sometimes may not know Pollock. So if you could just describe that so that everyone would sort of jump in and understand.
If you haven't seen a Pollock, do go online and explore these paintings because they're very abstract paintings. He had a style which is, it's called drip painting. So he would basically just take a pot of paint and flick paint across the canvas. So it looks like just a complete mess. And I think, some people's criticism is, well, where's the art in this? Where, surely anyone can make this. And actually, I tell the story about how somebody discovered 20 previously undiscovered Pollocks in their attic and tried to sell them for huge prices. But it was a mathematical analysis of these canvases which revealed that they could not have been made by Pollock because Pollock was doing something very special when he was making his paintings, because the reason these paintings are so magical is that they really don't have a sense of scale. So this means that if you zoom in on a section of a Jackson Pollock, it never seems to simplify. It seems to maintain the complexity of and they're generally quite huge canvases. But I've done experiments where I've done sort of 4 zoomed in sections of a Pollock, getting closer and closer and closer. At one point, you start to see the pixels of paint. So you know when you're very close. But before that, it's really difficult to tell at what scale you are. And this is the characteristic of this geometry that we discovered in the 20th century called a fractal. Fractal geometry is geometry that when you zoom in on it, it doesn't simplify. It seems to be scaleless. And that's somehow the magic of standing in front of a Pollock, is that you sort of fall into it because you sort of can't judge how near or far away you are from it. And so, and you get these fractals by a very particular painting style. You see, if I was going to fake a Pollock, I would probably just move my lower arm around and flick paint. But this just creates a very regular pendulum, which is just swinging backwards and forwards. But Pollock is doing something different. He's actually using his whole arm and almost dances. If you see videos of him painting, he's actually creating not a simple pendulum, but what we call a chaotic pendulum. And the geometry of chaos, which is this very unpredictable kind of dynamic system, is a fractal. So his painting style was very unique and created this fractal quality on the canvas, which is something that we can then measure from a mathematical point of view. And so the paintings that were revealed in this
is what the copycats. This is what the copycats would miss. And the beautiful demonstration you did for
paint,
us.
But it just didn't have, exactly. So actually it means there is a way to fake a Pollock. You just have to set up a chaotic pendulum and put paint on the bottom. But let me link this again, this whole triangle back to the natural world, because the geometry of nature is the fractal. And so I went to Pollock's studio and it's surrounded by forest. We went at winter time when all the leaves had come down and you just see fractals around you. You see the main trunk and then branches and then smaller branches. Is this kind of same structure, reproduced at different scales. And so nature is using the idea of a fractal to grow things. And this is what Pollock was responding to. He didn't know he was making fractals. Again, here's a artist just being drawn to an abstract structure which is mimicking what he was seeing in the natural world around him. And just flicking paint around wasn't doing it for him. He had to do this thing which produced this complexity and scaleless quality that the nature has.
Interesting. When I was in art school, the simple mathematics, when we had to deal with a blank canvas, we were told to obey the law of the thirds, that, just divide a canvas into 3 parts and then have your mean, whatever, your painting, whatever your main image is, have it to sit on one of the thirds, and then that image would be very attractive. A more complex thing was the golden ratio. Is there any simple way to understand this?
Yes. So the golden ratio is another structure in the book. It's another one of the blueprints. And Leonardo, for example, a lot of his work very knowingly exploits the golden ratio to create a certain effect, because the golden ratio is very related to the Fibonacci numbers. Because if you take squares of Fibonacci number dimensions and build up a rectangle in a spiral, you get a rectangle which is closer and closer to this ratio called the golden ratio. So the golden ratio is a ratio which, if you take a rectangle and you look at the ratio of the long side divided by the short side, if that's the same as the sum of the two sides to the long side, then we say that it's in the golden ratio. But the reason this is such an aesthetically pleasing ratio, I think, is related to this kind of Fibonacci spiral that you see inside. So it means that your eye is drawn to certain places which are not the center, as you say. I mean, you already said the idea of thirds is quite useful, and you put something off center but not too to the extreme. But the golden ratio, sort of, your eye naturally focuses on particular places where this spiral guides you to. And if you look at Leonardo's work, or other artists as well, they will often be putting the important things in places which are significant to the golden ratio. And, the golden ratio has a lovely property that if I take a rectangle in the golden ratio, cut off a square in the proportions of the short ratio side, the rectangle that's left is also in the golden ratio. So you get this, again, it's almost like the fractal. You get this repetition of dimensions at smaller and smaller scales. If you keep on cutting squares, you'll just get smaller and smaller golden ratios. So, architects love this. Palladio enjoy the sort of games that you can play in a room where, if you divide the room in two, for example, you get rooms which have the same proportion as the original room. So that's actually related to not the golden ratio, but the square root of 2. So actually, an A4 piece of paper, if you fold it in half, it has the same proportions as the original. It goes down to A5, but A5 is the same proportions but smaller as A4. So, and this is the power of the square root of 2. And Palladio used this a lot in his buildings. So a lot of things are in the ratio of 1 to the square root of 2, because if he halved the room, you would get this room in the same kind of proportions. The other thing Palladio loved is whole numbers. So often he loves symmetry, but also whole numbers. So you get rooms which are in a 2 to 3 relationship. Now, as a musician, you'll recognize, 2 to 3, that's important, because that's the ratio of a perfect fifth. That's what harmony is built out of. The whole of musical structure is built out of the ear enjoying hearing things in a 2 to 3 relationship. But there's Palladio moving it not from music into the visual. We also enjoy being in a room which is in a 2 to 3 relationship, because, and we call it, his architecture is often celebrated as frozen music.
Amazing. This is absolutely wonderful. So, Marcus, you work across mathematics, theater, music, writing, broadcasting. Has moving across these domains, what have been the challenges, and what has you taught you? What has this kind of moving taught you about some fundamental interconnectedness in all these different explorations?
Well, I think it is this idea that, you can have a common structure at the heart of very different artistic disciplines. I think that was the exciting thing about writing this book. The way I structured it sort of led me to the surprises of just seeing, for example, platonic solids are one of the structures. And I start with a choreographer, Rudolf Laban, using those as guiding his dancers to produce a very particular style of dance, which anybody who watches will recognize when it's a Laban style of dance. But then those are also used by, Leonardo is painting them. They are a beautiful illustration of the power of perspective in the Renaissance. So you see these platonic solids, dodecahedrons popping up. You see a few in sort of on my shelf up here. But they're used in the artistic world. Dali uses them, but then you hear them in music as well. So Yanis Xenakis, a composer that actually was also an architect who worked with Le Corbusier, uses the symmetries of a cube. a platonic solid to make music. So I think that's what's been so exciting, that although I've worked in very many different disciplines, um, I'm seeing the same structures, but we're just realized in words, and then in music, and then in buildings, and then in paint. That's been just really exciting, and all leads you to that idea of the combinational creativity. Well, okay, I've seen this structure being used in visuals, but then does that mean I could use it in choreography? How would that work? Some Sometimes it's hard to move from one discipline to another, but I think
Yeah.
that's something being hard is often the key to something having, real rich creativity waiting to be discovered.
But often when things get hard, people abandon that. I mean, there are very few who actually stay with it long enough for it to get figured out. So I was curious that, because there must have been many times when, you're struggling with something and you feel that, I don't know if this is worth it. I don't even know whether it's going to work out the way I'm
Oh yeah.
presuming. And in such times, do you have a strategy, or how do you actually stay with things without giving up? Because I know most end up doing that because, sometime mid journey, you do feel that I don't know if this is going anywhere.
The important thing for me is to have multiple projects on the go. So, because this means, I do this mathematically, so I will have several mathematical problems. And so when I got stuck on one and just nothing is happening, I will move to the other one. But I also have this in my kind of creative projects as well. So, I have this play that I'm working on at the moment. I've got a book that I'm writing. I've got music projects. And so if I get kind of stuck or stale or bored by moving to the other one, when I come back, it's with fresh eyes very often because I've been in another world. And so that's often a really important way of just of overcoming an obstacle that you might have hit. You need to move away and sort of come at it from a different angle, and then suddenly you find a way through to the other side.
Um, Mathematics is often associated with quantitative data and things that, we can count, measure. But much of human experience, including the arts, are associated with emotion, with meaning, with sensitivity. So, you've called mathematics as the language of the universe. But, so how can we sort of understand this? That, because with the language of the universe, we would have a lot of the qualitative data. So how do we have this kind of both coexist in a way?
Yeah, I think this is the mistake that people make, you see. They think that mathematics is quantitative, and actually I hardly ever write a number down. It's not about measuring or quantity at all. That goes back to G.H. Hardy's idea that, kind of the useful things of making a bridge, you probably do have to do a bit of measuring and things, but actually mathematics is, as I said, it's about pattern, it's about structure, it's about storytelling, it's about narrative, it's about logical connections between things. So all of those things are, not about quantitative things. So they may start with the quantitative, but very often you then throw those away and just realize, well, that the actual quantities are unimportant. So, so I think that's the connection, and the emotional side. You see, this is also really important because when I've talked to creative artists, they rarely put the emotion first. The emotion is very often the last thing to emerge and will not. If you try and deliberately put emotion in, it will not work. So, Philip Glass is somebody I talk about in my book Blueprints, and he always said, I'm interested in just exploring just structures, and the brain responds to the patterns that are being developed because it enjoys recognizing the development, and of course that recognition goes back to an evolutionary advantage that pattern searching gives you. If you can spot a pattern, you're going to survive. So that's why we get a sudden dopamine rush, because by spotting a pattern, it's going to give you an edge. So Philip Glass talks about, I'm interested in just developing the things that the brain will enjoy exploring and trying to kind of reverse engineer. And then that will lead to an emotional response. But you can't put the emotions in right at the beginning. And I think that's the mistake. So I think there are two mistakes that are being made in this, which is what my book is really trying to sort of, first of all, maths isn't quantitative. It's very much an emotional response to structures and things like that. Secondly, art is not primarily emotional and mystical. It's very much based on structure. So most people will listen to things and don't understand how it's made. But if you talk to the person who made it, often they won't want to reveal the structure. That's important. They don't want you to know how it was made. And, I love this quote of Carl Friedrich Gauss, a number theorist of the 19th century, when he wrote a book about number theory, and everyone complained about, my gosh, there are rabbits coming out of hats everywhere. Where did all of these ideas come from? And he says, well, what do you mean? I'm not going to tell you where the ideas come from. An architect does not leave up the scaffolding once he's finished or she's finished the building.
Right.
And I think, many artists, I work with a composer, Emily Howard. She uses a lot of mathematical ideas in her kind of compositional practice. And I talk about her work in the book as well. She's somebody I work a lot with. We've set up a center in the Royal Northern College of Music called PRISM, which stands for Practice and Research in Science and Music. But she says, I don't want people to know the geometric shape, how it's been used to, and often it's not being used very, in a formulaic way. It'll be the inspiration for it. But for her, that's the beginning. But she wants people to listen to that piece of music without.
Yeah, just to gain the experience, just to feel it without really kind of analyzing it. Yeah. Just to change things up a bit, does math play any role in religion, according to your understanding? In India, we have this concept of shunyata, or emptiness. And incidentally, it's also known, India is known to have introduced zero, which in a sense can mean nothing and still can mean a lot. So, any
yes, I think
thoughts on this?
This is one of the big themes. The big themes in the play that I wrote is it starts with nothing, the empty set, there's a kind of play on words, because we have the empty set is a mathematical idea of nothing, and the empty set, of course, is a set in a theatre sense. And actually, modern mathematics now shows that you can make everything from nothing. So the empty set, which is, the idea of nothing in mathematics, is then the seed from which everything else grows. And sunyata is, of course, sunya is nothing, is the possibility of something. It was never meant to be nothing. And so this is something I explore in the play. And there's a big India theme in this play. It's called the axiom of choice, but starts with the idea that the empty set, nothing, is how you make the whole of mathematics. And here is where I would say the connection to religion happens, because for me, a lot of people, when they start to understand the universe, they say, well, so much mathematics involved. God, if he exists, must have been a mathematician. But I would reverse that and say, no, God isn't a mathematician. You see, if you need, one of the big questions of religion is trying to answer, and science as well, is, where did all of this stuff come from? What created our universe? And so if you need something to be a creator, you need something which is outside of time, which doesn't need its own moment of creation. And this is what my kids always say, well, if God created the universe, who created God? And they do this kind of infinite regret. But actually, my feeling is you need something which doesn't need a moment of creation. And for me, that is mathematics, because mathematics is just the structures which are possible. There's a moment when a human discovers or creates mathematics for the first time, but essentially it all exists there in a kind of Platonic realm of ideas. So my feeling is that we are living in, the reason we're seeing so much mathematics in nature is that we are a physicalized piece of mathematics. I love the allegory that Plato had of the cave, of, the abstract world of ideas, Platonic ideas. Then we are seeing the shadows on the cave wall, and that is the universe we see around us. So my kind of belief is that often religion is trying to understand where all of this comes from, why there is so much sort of design in it, is that the God that you're all looking for is mathematics, that mathematics is the beginning of it all. And actually, as you said, it comes from Sunya, from nothing. Nothing is the beginning of everything.
Perfect. You once said that every great discovery is an act of unlearning. What's the hardest idea you've had to unlearn?
Well, I've got to, one of the things that you do as a mathematician, you think that things are going to you see a sort of pattern emerging and you start to make a conjecture and you think, well, okay, I believe that whenever you look at these structures, they will always have this pattern. And so I made a conjecture about a certain symmetry that I thought happened in the equations that I was looking at. And I remember this time when my PhD student, one of them came in to the office and he was looking very sheepish and he was showing me some examples and he said, and I've discovered this. And he discovered an example where this symmetry wasn't there. And he thought I was going to be very upset. He thought that, suddenly this thing I've been working on for years had been revealed to be false. But I had to unlearn, that was the thing I'd been chasing. And I realized it wasn't true. But, that's always exciting. It reveals complexity that I didn't realize was there before. And so maybe it's richer because of having to unlearn and to disconnect from the way I thought things were. That was an important learning process. So you must be ready to throw things away that you're attached to.
Yeah, I think
very
that's
Buddhist belief.
Yes. It's also, like when you learn, you need to keep everything together. But when you perform, you need to just leave everything and allow things to just take a life of their own, however they're meant to in that moment. Yeah. Also, in your film, What Makes a Genius? You ask, could I have come up with Einstein's theory of relativity? So what are your thoughts on genius?
Yes, very overrated. So I think, if you actually dig into the lives of those people we regard as kind of groundbreakers, it goes back to this idea of where do our creative acts come from? They very often are incremental in nature, but they can often look as if there's been a huge phase change happen. But, for example, Einstein's theory of special relativity was it was inevitable that it was going to be discovered. It just needed somebody to put these two kind of things together and realize that they didn't work, and it pushed whoever, there was a contradiction, and that, contradictions are very rich because they question the fact that you really don't understand how the thing's working. So often I think that in retrospect, something looks like it's come out of nowhere. But if you dig into the biography or the history, you'll see that those phase changes often were almost an inevitability of just the limits that you'd reached of one particular structure leading through to the breaking into a completely new area. So, I think, who was it that said genius is 99% perspiration and 1% inspiration?
Yeah.
I think that's been credited to many people. Probably Einstein is credited, or Oscar Wilde, but I think, that is, people work hard for their breakthroughs. And so I think and often they want to cover that up. It goes back to that Gauss quote that people quite like, sort of making it look like it was almost magically appeared, and they will often cover their tracks to accentuate their genius.
Yeah, that's so true. And thank you for saying this, because I think it'll be comforting to so many who think that they can never really achieve anything, that they're separate. And just this idea that the geniuses are just those few exceptional people. And the way you've explained it really just shows that we all as humans carry the potential. It's just a matter that are we willing to really become conscious, engage, and do we really want to explore and and really put out something. So it's not something which is just exclusive to certain people who we call geniuses.
Yeah, I think that was what I sort of gathered through making that program, that geniuses are made, not born.
So on a parting note, any predictions about how AI will impact creativity?
Yes, I wrote a whole book about this, actually, called The Creativity Code, because I was starting to see the exciting potential of AI to actually stimulate human creativity. I think a lot of people are very worried at the moment somehow that this is going to put them out of a job as creative artists. And I think we have to recognize that this is a very powerful new tool. And just in the same way as the camera didn't put painting out of, of operation, it's just a new way of making things. I think the most powerful way is as a collaborator, not a competitor. So, I have this beautiful example of Bernard Lubat, a jazz pianist in Paris, trained up an AI on his improvisational style. And they did a concert together, and the audience couldn't tell which was human and which was AI, but it was more interesting was the response that Bernard Lubat had to playing with this AI, because he said after the concert, everything that AI is playing, I recognize it's me, but it's doing things I've never ever thought of doing before. And I think that's a kind of great example of the power of AI in exploratory creativity, that, you might have a data set of improvisation or maybe painting or literature or something. And the AI may discover new things that you can do with that world that you hadn't thought of doing before. And I think it goes back to what we talked about quite a lot in this conversation, which is that very often humans, we get stuck in ways of behaving. We repeat behaviors. We become more like the machine. And what I'm seeing is the exciting possibility for AI to actually challenge those kind of patterns of behavior and offer us something new. So the AI weirdly might help us to stop behaving like machines and actually start us to make behaving more again as creative human
Wow.
beings.
That's beautiful, Marcus. And that's so positive and also pointed in a different way of thinking. I really appreciate this idea that just what you described now is very powerful for me to understand, because, I was feeling conflicted that now are we somewhere going to be guilty of getting ready-made ideas? But I really love this way of looking at things, that I feel thanks to education and society, we've moved so far away from our creativity that we've become like machines, like robots in certain ways. And perhaps the very thing that we're fearing, AI, perhaps that might, if we are consciously able to look at it, perhaps this might be again the very thing that could help us to reconnect with our inherent creativity. So
I totally agree with
thank
you.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. That's a lovely perspective, because wherever I go, people appear to be really scared, terrified. And rather than look at AI in that way, it wasn't even intended or created to be looked at in that way. I think that really engaging and considering it your friend rather than enemy is absolutely the way to look at it. So, Marcus, thank you so much, not just for a wonderful conversation, but I think that a lot of people like me who have always been afraid of math and, have been trying to run away from it, now actually might look at math in a different way. And on the other hand, those who've seen math as just isolated, perhaps will start to see the connection of math with the arts, with creativity. So I think you've done an amazing thing in unifying this. And today, the simple way in which you kind of broke it down and described this lovely connection is very much appreciated. Thank you so
Well,
much.
thank you for this exciting conversation about creativity.
Thank you, Marcus. I've loved having you on the Creativity Dialogues. Thank you once again.
Thank you.